you, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'd like to pay respect to my panellist sisters and comrades here, and thank them for the work that they all do. Today I'm going to be speaking about who is the political opposition to the feminist, human rights, survivor-led abolitionist movement. Because I think we need to know exactly the tactics that they use and how they are a danger to our goals, but how we can combat and challenge the mythology, the lies and misinformation that we get from the pro-pimp lobby. And I just want to give two little examples of how well organised and how active they are today. One is, right now as we speak here, in London, England, there is a feminist conference being held which clearly states that although it will represent a huge number of views from women around the world, that its bottom line is that it supports criminalising the demand for commercial sex. And that has caused quite a lot of problems. And this morning, the English collective of prostitutes who represent themselves as women currently working in the sex trade, which I am saying clearly is a lie, have leafleted the entire conference with a view to disrupt it. And I'm so sorry that they don't allow us to have our views expressed at a feminist conference when they so clearly have the international stage pretty much to themselves at the moment, although increasingly challenged by the abolitionist movement. So that's the good news. The second anecdote was when I was recently in Cambodia doing research for my book on the sex trade, and I asked through a women's organisation, a Cambodian local women's organisation, if I could meet some of the women working in prostitution and if they could facilitate that, because going around the sex trade areas and just plucking women off the streets to talk to is highly unethical, I think, and also very dangerous for them. And this organisation referred to the women as sex workers and said they were sex workers' rights advocates. And she was helpful and friendly and said, even though it was me, that she would speak to some women and see if they would meet with me. And she then asked me a series of questions: what is in it for them? What will you do with the information? All perfectly reasonable questions. And I said, well, bearing in mind that they are sex workers' rights advocates and they are pushing for legalisation or decriminalisation, what I will say to them is that I have been campaigning along with my sisters for decades to decriminalise the women in prostitution, anyone in prostitution. No one selling sex should ever be criminalised, should ever be seen as anything other than somebody in need of support. So I went along to the meeting, and it was early in the morning, it was 8 AM, so the women were clearly coming to talk with me after they had been prostituted all night. And as they walked in and I saw the women, I instantly knew that the questions about what will you do with the information, will you misrepresent them, but aren't you a prohibitionist, that they hadn't come from the women themselves. These women could not wait to tell me about the abuse, the terror, the violation inherent to prostitution. But we were working through a translator, and the translator kept telling me that they were saying, in sex work this happens, in sex work that happens. As a sex worker, I want this. So I was carefully noting everything and recording them. And then the woman who runs the NGO, who was the one I was in contact with, told me that it was a wonderful thing for the women to be in a union, that they had at least 50,000 sex workers in Cambodia in this union, and that what they did was that when the women were arrested by the corrupt police, who were abusive to the women, who would put them in prison not for prostitution but for public order, minor issues, that this organisation would come along and get them out of jail the next day. That if they had children, and many of the women had children with sex buyers, or rather they had been pregnant by sex buyers, and that they would give childcare while the woman was in prison overnight. And this is why it was great for the women to be in this union. And suddenly everything became clear. This was not a union at all. Which woman in prostitution would say no to an organisation that comes along and says for 25 cents a month, if you are arrested, we will come and get you out of jail and look after your child? And I realised, of course, it's what pimps do, isn't it? And I then realised that this organisation goes all around the region, to South Korea, to Vietnam, to wherever. I think on your patch as well, Ruchira, to speak about sex workers' rights and how Cambodian sex workers want legalisation. So do you see how they do it? These women want the police to leave them alone. These women want to come out of the sex trade so badly that they were telling me that for $200, if they had their proper papers, they could leave and they could get some kind of unskilled job. What is this organisation who is well funded doing for these women? Why are they giving them the $200 and organising their papers and finding them somewhere to live, rather than using them as a mouthpiece for international decriminalisation of pimping and brothel? And this is something, and I'm interested to hear from you, Ruchira, and any other colleagues here, this is a tactic that they are using. Because this funding to these NGOs, especially in the global south, benefit no one but those who are running the NGOs. And I also want to go from that horrifically impoverished scene of these women who were some of the most disenfranchised, abused, and poor women I've ever met in the sex trade, to the North America, or Western Europe, or wherever in the global north, where men, white men, very well paid white men, or women, but increasingly largely men, run anti-trafficking organisations that concern themselves more with men who are trafficked into the agribusiness, and separate trafficking into prostitution with prostitution itself, and are, I have to tell you, hindering our work, not helping. The more that we hear from these anti-trafficking advocates, the more we hear from those highly funded professionals who give keynote speeches at conferences about how trafficking is terrible, but prostitution, of course, they don't have a policy on it. The worse things get for us, the less funding we have to do our work. And I'm afraid I would go so far as to say that along with those sex workers' rights movements in the global south, these white people in the global north are our enemies to this movement. And it has to be said. And we have to do something about the colonisation of our movement by those that use the term trafficking to completely sanitise what is actually happening in the sex trade and in prostitution. So, the pro-sex work groups, I'm just going to give you some global excuse me, pointers as to how they organise. There are major funders of pro-sex work projects, and I wish in a way that we could just point to a conspiracy, to a global conspiracy, that we could then infiltrate and disrupt. But it's not like that. There are people who are pro-sex workers' rights advocates,